Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. It's first I want to thank our panel who will be introducing themselves in just a minute, but it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight for such an important topic, climate change and how we think and understand the impact on cost. It's just such an important dialogue, and really honored to have this panel facilitated and brought together by our student leaders in the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. My name is Jeff Thies, and I'm clinical faculty and director of the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. And again, just want to thank all of our participants and for both the discussion and the insights that we're going to gain from this evening. And specifically, I'd like to introduce our student moderators for this evening, Naomi Alvarado and Nicholas Salkin. Now we pass it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
All right. Hello, everyone. As Dr. Thies introduced, my name is Nicholas Salkin, and we also have...
My name is Naomi Alvarado, and we're very happy that you guys were able to join us. Before we hop into our questions, we would like our panelists to introduce themselves and what brought you to this topic.
Hello, good evening. I'm Junghoon Park. I'm an assistant professor of management at the College of Business Administration. I currently teach an undergrad course, which is strategic management, but all of my research projects are sort of at the intersection of sustainability and business. I think that's why I was invited. I don't necessarily just talk about business perspective, but I probably need to bring in our conversation. So nice to meet you, and then looking forward to our conversation.
Hello, I'm Jarvis. I'm an associate professor of management and sustainability here in the College of Business. This topic is close to home for me in that my research and background looks at the hidden impacts of environmentalism. Probably the thing I'm most famous for, maybe infamous for, I don't know, is my research on recycling, where I basically show that it's not only a waste of time, but actually worse for the planet than throwing things away. Probably not the venue to talk about that today, but another time. But yeah, very excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, my name is Dane Lazarus. I am a science research and policy specialist coming from USC Sea Grant. If you're not familiar, Sea Grant is a partnership between NOAA, the federal agency responsible for oceans and atmosphere, and different universities around the country. So in this case, USC. My area of specialty is coastal resilience and climate change, so very much focused on the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, erosional patterns, and the economic impacts thereof. This has always been an area of interest for me. My undergraduate was in ecology and evolution from UCSB, and then I did the master's in civil engineering here. So I identify as a coastal engineer, although that's not my formal training. It is what I have been doing for 8 years now.
My name is Clare. I'm an assistant professor in urban and environmental studies. Happy to see a number of very friendly faces. I am a geographer, fundamentally interested in human nature relationships. I teach courses on environmental justice, sustainable urbanism, and I'm really interested in governance and sustainability questions, governance and justice issues and sustainability. So that's what I'll have to say today about pricing and climate change.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Jarvis. I'm a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. I do teach one course in the College of Business in the Master's Program for Sustainability and Entrepreneurial Innovation. My background, my research area is very esoteric in some ways, quantum calculations for applications though that have to do with sustainability. A lot of that is alternative energy in focus. But then I've also worked in the US Senate on science policy issues, a lot of policy side of things. And then I still have some of those activities going on as well. I also like to work with green chemistry and other forms of metrics of sustainability. Thanks for being here.
So I think let's just start with the big question, the question that got us all here. So where do you see, each one of you, see climate change affecting the everyday life of your average LMU student?
I mean, I'm going to take the elephant in the room. I think right now with the fires that one of the ones just started, right? We started our I live in Malibu, so I've been very impacted by the last month. We actually had the Franklin fire come right up to our back door. And so I didn't do one of my review sessions in December as a result of being evacuated. And then that's really what saved us from the Palisades fire. Now we have more going on, and is climate change the only issue? Certainly not, but it's one that's very, very influential, and certainly the costs of that are just beginning and are going to be with us for decades.
Yeah, I agree. The premise of this panel is to think about pricing impacts and sort of the economic register of climate change. And yet, I think given the 2 weeks that we have just lived, some more intimately than others, and maybe Emily, in your case, it's been the last couple of months, back to the Franklin fire, we know that climate change is a fundamentally economic and political process with deep economic and political consequences. But I think in lieu of collectivized economic and political reform, which has been lacking since James Hansen testified in front of Congress in the late 80s about a phenomenon called global warming, we have been left to deal with climate change as an individual experience. And right now, especially what I'm reflecting on, is the individual, the emotional, psychological thing that I just lived alone inside of my house for the last 7 days, and I'm still unpacking what that was like. So I think to answer the question, right now we are in a context because of broader political economic forces and intractability where we're living climate change as a largely emotional, psychological experience that has its own set of costs that are economic, but they're also deeply affective, existential, extra economic. And so I think we now feel this in a way that if we were having this conversation in October or September, we probably would be we'd be focusing on different things. But I just want to bring to the fore the import and the enormity of the emotional, psychological, which I think maybe will move us in a way that the economic political has not. And I want to bring forward this distinction between, in lieu of collective decision-making as a society, we are struggling with these experiences as individuals.
Well, I'll add on to that to take it from the more acute effects a little bit to more diffuse effects of climate change really being kind of the sprinkles on the cake of every disaster. So every natural disaster that we're seeing, there is an element of climate change behind that, making it worse, increasing the wet dry cycles that we're seeing, the El Nino effects, increasing the brush that builds up that is then available to burn, increasing the drought that makes it dry enough to burn, and increasing the winds that we see that drove those fires that we saw recently. So those acute effects, but climate change has some impact accelerating every storm that we're seeing, every fire that we see, every shift in range of agriculture, every shift in range of species, it has its finger on. So it's really diffuse and everywhere, but also acute in every event that we experience personally.
So the sprinkles on which one's the cake, which one's the sprinkles?
The disaster cake and the sprinkles are climate change.
Got it, got it. This is a strange metaphor, I love it. It's so evocative and so terrifying at the same time.
It's not a good cake.
Yeah, gosh, there's so many directions that we could go, and Clare so thankfully brought up the sort of the emotional aspect of this, because as we're forced to kind of deal with this as individuals, we have individual experiences of fear and uncertainty and the unknown, and what does the future of your life look like? Fast forward 50 years, 70 years, 80 years, what does that look like? I don't know. So I hope we can dive into that a little bit, and what sort of, it's been thrust upon us as individuals, what kind of individual responsibilities do we have, and power do we have to do things? One thing that when I saw this question from our moderators, that immediately came to mind, that I think is something that probably most people don't ever think about, is this weird thing called the water energy nexus. And so give me just 2 minutes to talk about the water energy nexus, because it might be just a eye-opening thing for you. So here in Southern California, all of our water essentially comes from somewhere north of here. Varying places north, depends on how far and where we are, and Dane can actually tell you more about the watersheds and the water storage and infrastructure. But it all comes from north of here. And in order to get the water here, you've got to move it a long way. And you can use gravity for some of that, but mostly you're using pumps. If you've ever driven north through the Grapevine, just before, right after Santa Clarita and Castaic, as you head up the hill, you'll see that giant set of pipes coming down the hill on the right side. That's water coming down from the other side of the hill, where it's been pumped up the hill on one side, it's coming down on this side. To pump water requires a huge amount of energy. You've got to lift it uphill. So that happens in various stages. You can look at a map of this from Northern California to Southern California. Point is, it takes a lot of energy to supply Southern California with water. On the other hand, how do we make our energy? Most of our energy in this country comes from burning something, turning water into steam and sending the steam through a turbine. So we need water to create energy, and we need energy to move water. They're actually the same thing, they're kind of connected. And then when you consider that food is just the strategic application of water and energy in the form of making artificial fertilizers, carting stuff around, then you realize it's not just the water energy nexus, it's the food water energy nexus, which is interesting because that means as energy gets more expensive, as water becomes more scarce, food also becomes more scarce. There's also some interesting opportunities here for some individual action and things that I want to get back to, but I'll just leave that sitting there right now. The food, water, energy nexus, they're all connected. The prices of one going up makes the prices of all three go up.
So before I came to this event, I was actually thinking about like what kind of everyday sort of topic I should deliver. Because not every student, I assume that we're not majoring like a business. But so I was thinking about my sort of like own background. So I grew up in Korea. So I spent like almost 28 years, and then it's been almost 6.5 years since I moved to the United States. So when I was younger in Korea, we didn't used to have any of those fine dust issues. But now, when you go to Korea, especially around like April, when the weather gets warmer and warmer, or like sometime in fall, you tend to see fine dust. So I was visiting my family back in Korea this winter. So I personally preferred like colder weather just because there was no fine dust. But when when the temperature sort of like increased, the fine dust sort of like was trapped closer to the ground. So. But why? Like, I assume that probably climate change chimed in. Climate change had driven global warming, and they definitely like increased the temperature on average, global average temperature, and then it sort of had trapped that kind of air pollutants were fine dust closer to the ground. So I really had never seen that kind of fine dust when I was younger, but now every day I see that. So climate change, as everyone pointed out, it's not just about some sort of environmental sustainability issue. It could be considered like a public health concern. And one thing that sort of made me consider not going back to Korea to be more selfish. I mean, I really feel sorry for my family and friends, but they do see fine dust every day, almost every day. But at least I don't see it in Los Angeles. I mean, we do have some air pollutants issue, but compared to Korea, it's sort of nothing. So that's one thing that I wanted to bring up as some sort of anecdotal evidence in terms of the relationship between climate change and some aspects of our everyday life.
Thank you all so much for your responses. I think something that was clearly emphasized across everything was how connected everything is. Energy, water, our emotional responses, the climate change that we see and the climate change that we don't. And so from that, I would like to ask, do you think enough of our conversations about climate change focus on this connectedness that everything has? And if not, how can we begin to shift in that direction?
You mean like shift in the direction to see more like that interconnectedness? So I have a couple research projects at the intersection of business and public health. Sounds very ambiguous, but they definitely do have some connections. One reason why I got motivated to sort of work on the public health concern from the business perspective is that if we frame so many different societal challenges versus sustainability issues, sort of under the bucket of public health, people do care about health. You don't want to feel sick, you don't want to feel under the weather. So I thought that that might be the probably good starting point to sort of like show the kind of interconnectedness among this, like, climate change, like public health concerns, like energy, water, emotional, like the physical sort of health concern, everything. So, one thing that, like as I wrote down already, like we defined this case back in Korea, one thing that we may not see, I mean, the title of this panel event is the cost that you don't actually see every day. But one thing that you may have not realized because we are sort of in the advanced economy, but of course, a lot of developing countries, there are lots of like climate refugees, and then actually climate change, this global warming could drive or could lead to the emergence and spread of like new infectious disease. So one of the theories were like, hypothesis that COVID-19 was facilitated by climate change because it has shaped some sort of like a favorable conditions for the emergence and spread of communicable disease. And I personally do believe that in the near future, unfortunately, we may see another round of pandemic or some sort of epidemics. So to avoid that, we need to sort of like put some effort into, think of like different sustainability issues and how does it affect you? What if it sort of affected your health? Like, everyday health, like a public health concerns, then I think you might probably start thinking about sort of different dots connecting different sort of sustainability issues.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like I mentioned before, the diffuseness of the climate change impacts, I think is one of the things that makes it really difficult to grapple with and to think about, because it really is pervasive across so many different aspects of our lives and so many different things. It makes it hard to come to terms with, it makes it hard to really think about concrete solutions to a problem. And it can be really overwhelming to discuss with people or to really think about. And I think thinking big but acting small is really important, and taking action where we can on whatever scale that we're able to do is really important just to get the ball rolling. And while your impacts may be small in themselves, the ripple effects can be massive. And come back to Claire's point on collective action, that's the only way real change is going to be possible, is starting small, getting enough people behind it, that those ripples start to echo upwards.
I guess I'll just add about the sort of atomization, separation. Many of us, all of us, those of us in this room that do science for a living, those of us who are practicing science, learning science here at the university, all of us have been betrayed by the practice of modern science because science is really good at separation, right? The scientific method is about isolation, thinking about things as separate in order to get a really fine-grained understanding about what is the nature of each part. And yet we have very ancient spiritual, religious, and increasingly sort of epistemological frameworks that are not new, but coming back into vogue, that help us remember that everything is connected, right? And it sort of goes back to this point about whatever your conceptualization of this planet, where it comes from, what it all means, energy is a base component of what's going on here. And energy is all connected, right? The recycling of energy is a closed loop. So I encourage you to be thinking about the ways in which your own training has forced you to think about things separately, and the ways in which you already see that everything is interconnected. And when it comes to things like climate change, which is sort of an existential experiment in learning that everything is connected, this is really fundamentally about human nature relationships. And what happens in one domain affects the other. So there's a lot to be said about it, and that sort of gets on the level of the philosophy of science. But all that is to say that science has, the sort of hegemonic practice of science has helped us re-inscribe this kind of nature culture binary. When in fact, what we're learning into the future that we're living into is that all of it is connected. How we treat the less of us, both the human and non-human, is sort of the fate of our well-being.
So I guess maybe just adding on to that, I'd say, I personally, and maybe this isn't a surprise, I don't have a problem with science and how it's practicing right now, but policy and how science runs, and really getting back to the focus here about the economics of science. That's run on grants, right? That's how we do research, that's pushed, and climate change at one point will be in vogue, that you better have something about climate change in your grants if you want it to get funded. As of 2 days ago, you better not have something in there if you wanted to get funded, even if it was already funded. Maybe that funding is going to be revoked on some of your clean energy projects. Some of your permits that you already received are no longer valid, and these sorts of things. We'll see this go into litigation, and the cost that then snowballs in all of this effect. And it's a complex issue, and there's never simple at this scale. There's never simple scientific answers, but then the overlay of the policy on top of that, there's no simple policy answers. And when I was working in science policy, it came home to me in a way that I never understood before, the difference between policy and politics. And I'm sure you all know, the English language definition of those and what those mean, but in practice, how that rolls out and the impact that has is huge. And when we're in a time of divisive politics, the cost of that on policy and in the swings that we have in terms of the federal investment in some of these large scale, long-term processes is just incredible, and it ends up being incredibly wasteful, unfortunately.
Well, I wasn't gonna get depressing, but Emily went there, so. Yeah, the question is, are things connected enough? The answer is no. Things are incredibly disconnected, and that they're disconnected because a fact about physical reality has become a disagreement about political teamism. And that just is, right? Like climate change, your stance on climate change, it depends on what color shirt you wear. And that's I don't know what to do about that. I'm not a political scientist. I don't know policy. I don't know. From what I'm seeing, it doesn't seem like anybody really knows what to do about that. But yeah, the interconnectedness of things is being intentionally obfuscated because it is politically expedient to do so. And without a reckoning on that scale, I don't see how connecting people to, the different costs that they're experiencing of climate change does anything, because all that gets, excuse the term, trumped by the importance of politics right now in people's lives.
So we went to some depressing, but also very large scale issues related to climate change. And I guess the next question would be, let's say some of our student audience wants to start taking some action. Climate change, how can they understand these problems in order to start taking some action?
So I'm going to try to stick with your question, but what comes to mind initially for me as someone in chemistry is something that, we were just kind of talking about how a lot of this has been politicized, but the great aspect of a lot of sustainability and efficient processes is that they are cheaper. And if we can account for that, everyone should be on board, you know, regardless of what their overall focus is. I mean, I think there is incredible importance just from a personal philosophy of how one lives their life, of going, you know, making sure that your values and what you are promoting aligns with what you're doing on a daily basis. I think that's incredibly important. But I also think that there's some really cool examples, and for me as a chemist, you know, the concept of green chemistry and what has been, you know, through initially what was the Presidential Green Chemistry Awards and then the EPA Green Chemistry Challenge, that it's not political at all, that there are huge Dow chemical companies that are going for these, there are small startups, there are universities, everyone in between, because ultimately at the end of the day, it is a savings to not be doing things wrong. And I think, you know, that we need to be careful of how we talk about certain things at this big picture sort of way, but on a day-to-day, avoiding problems is so much easier than creating a problem and then thinking how to clean it up.
I think the easiest thing I can suggest is coming to things like this, thinking about climate change, and not just thinking about climate change, but talking to people about climate change. This is maybe jumping the prompts a little bit to some of the later ones about how to talk to people about climate change. But something I recently learned is that there really is this false social reality going on, and the number of people in the US from polling by Yale University that are worried about climate change massively outweighs the percent of people that those people think are worried. So much more people are worried about it, and they think far fewer other people are worried about it, which disincentivizes them from talking about it, which disincentivizes people from taking action because they think other people aren't worried about it. It's going to be awkward if I bring it up. It's going to be a weird conversation. So talk about it. Don't be awkward about it. Don't be weird about it. And recognize that more people are probably open to those conversations than you might expect. And we'll get into how to have those conversations, I expect, more later.
Yeah, so is the question more about, you know, what do people do day to day living their lives, or is the question more, you know, how much impact does an individual have, or is it you know, about the win-wins in environmentalism and lower cost?
Let's say like,
Microphone.
who's my best theater voice? Yeah, so I was trying to phrase the question more of like, as an individual,
Yeah.
like, how can we like start thinking about these big issues in order to start taking action? But if you want to delve into some others.
No, that's good. And I think, okay, so how do you start thinking about the issue? I think you start thinking about the issue with existential terror and dread. Because I think if you're just like, oh, this is a thing that I saw on the news and there's something about climate change, and if it never connects home to you, and the fact that like this is the reality that you have inherited, and we're all so sorry for that, unless this connects on like a visceral level of like, oh God, I got to do something, then I think it doesn't ever like become real, and it doesn't ever affect the way you think moment to moment and the decisions that you make day to day. But once it does, once it connects and you start like looking up, as the movie Don't Look Up, once you're like, oh my God, then there are some things that you can do, right? These conversations that my colleagues have been talking about, the coalition building, right? Every social movement in history has been started by a small group of people who are committed, who convince the people around them to care about it, and that number of people grows and grows and grows, and then you have revolutions of various kinds. I think also, though, it is very important to not trick yourself into thinking that little things that you do matter. It's very, very easy, and we have a lot of messaging in the world, mostly from corporations, that you can do tiny things and they will all add up and then everything will be okay. And that's just the reality, that's not the case. I just pulled some data before walking down here, that people talk about, oh, you should unplug your charger for your phone, right? Because your charger is just sitting there while you're at school or at work and it's just consuming energy. You should unplug your charger. Guess what? If everyone in the United States unplugs their phone charger while they're away, that will save 490,000 tons of CO2 emissions a year. Is that a lot? I don't know. Let's see. It represents 0.03% of the emissions the United States would need to decrease CO2 emissions to meet the IPCC's climate change targets. 0.03%. It does not matter. Plastic straws, 0.01%. Does not matter. On the other hand, if everyone stopped eating meat 1 day a week in the United States, cut their meat consumption by 1/7, that's 5% of the US necessary reduction in CO2 emissions. So there are things that you can do, and there are conversations that you can have with people to get them to change their behavior in important ways. But there are also a lot of ways that you have been convinced that you're doing things that matter that really are just serving corporate interests.
Can I say one thing I want to say on that though is thinking about, okay, if any of you follow sports, follow baseball or tennis, a lot of times these greats, the people that are just at this next level in this performance, they go through their routines, they have to, Nadal would have to go through and slap his arms and legs and, and people have to twist different things before they get up to bat. There's kind of a routine and almost a meditative state to kind of get ready for the moment. And while I do think there's a lot of things that are very minimal on a day-to-day basis, like unplugging your charger or exactly the car you drive in terms, various things. A lot of these are also though in, I think, shaping kind of the aura of what you value and what is important and just where your thought is. And I do think that in that regard, it's not necessarily meaningless. Like in terms of like what adds up in terms of exact kilowatt hours of energy and different things, but in terms of creating a sense of value and a sense of this matters to me and it is pervasive in my life, I think there's still value even there. And then it crosses over to hopefully creating that urge to say, where can this have the most impact? And a lot of that's going to have the most impact by what we then force the businesses to do, since there is so much more of that, but that us not having meat once a week and then saying, if I'm going to eat meat or if I'm not going to, what companies do I want to support when I'm doing this, and where am I going to put my money where my mouth is, literally. I think that those things can matter and kind of this living life in that direction in a lot of different intentional ways has meaning in my
I think so too. I think if you can do things that reinforce your own identity as a person who cares about stuff, and if you're if you're using your toothbrush water running time to warm up the water for your face wash time, if you're like, this because I'm an environmental producer, if that bleeds over into then you start having conversations or whatever, that's great. The danger is that it doesn't, and you think that what you're doing is just enough. But I think that if you can create your own self-identity, and also if you can create your own self-identity in a way that's visible to other people, and they start asking you about these things, try it. If you're going out to dinner after this or anytime this week with your friends, try getting a vegetarian version of whatever you would normally get. Just order something without meat. I guarantee you, your friends are going to be like, yo, what's going on? Now you have an opportunity to have a conversation. So identity can bleed into other people's identity as well.
I mean, what can I say? I don't have any small action related suggestions. I mean, I'm drinking bottled water, although it may not be directly pertinent to climate change or global warming, but clearly, it could contribute to some plastic pollution issue and everything. But just, in particular for students, I just want to make two suggestions, and my suggestions are just basically twofold. A, just regardless of your political viewpoint, it might be better for us to acknowledge that climate change or global warming is out there. I think that's the probably very first important step. And B, you don't necessarily need to buy less things, buy things less, that kind of stuff, all good. But maybe educate yourself after you acknowledge that climate change is out there. Just take a look at some of the news articles, and then of course, not surprisingly, right after the new president was elected, and then he already decided that the U.S. decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, which might be fine, but don't take it as a signal that your country doesn't care about climate change or anything. You as an individual, you can still believe the idea that climate change is it's an ongoing issue which we actually need to tackle. So maybe those are the two things, maybe as a student, that you can easily do.
Thank you very much for those answers. The idea about cutting 1/7 of your meat consumption down, that was really interesting. And it made me wonder if there was one consumer behavior or one consumer expectation, like with the meat, that you could just snap your fingers and change, what would it be and why?
So my friends and I joke, if I could do anything with a snap of a finger, I would eradicate every cow on the planet. No more cows. That's it. I mean, there is no more. If you look at the numbers, if you look at the life cycle assessment is the field that measures the environmental impact of products or services over their whole life cycle, from material extraction, production, transportation, use, disposal. And if you look at all the different options we have available to us as individuals, right? Obviously, big things matter a lot more. Voting, changing coalitions, changing policy matters a whole lot more. But if we're talking about individual actions, the biggest thing you can do is change your diet. It is by far, hands down, more important than anything else you will do. So yeah, if I'm Thanos, it's cows, and I just keep snapping until there's none left.
In defense of the cow, maybe we don't need to commit species genocide on cows. Maybe we just need to stop eating them and stop mass manufacturing their bodies in feedlots. So yeah, I'm point taken. Stop eating cows, maybe not, kill cows. I think the way that I would answer this question, snap my fingers and we would stop this human behavior, it would be single use. The habituality, the habituousness of using something once, a straw, a fork, a to-go box, whatever. Nothing is disposed of.
I like these, and I getting back to the cow thing, there's a really interesting article it was about last month in the New York Times, and it said this is the future of where your food comes from, or something like this. And it was very interesting because it was kind of arguing that going into the future, rather than going more to, from a sustainability perspective, rather than going more to kind of regenerative farming and a variety of words that those of us in the sustainability world are like, yeah, this, it was kind of going much more towards large scale factory farming and the efficiencies of scale and these sorts of things. And it's interesting. And then if you read that and then read the response, the letters to the editor for this, it's a lot of interesting things to think about. And actually, that's one of the topics we're covering in my class right now, is kind of an area to wrestle with, because yeah, cows and other things are a challenge to think how we can make that efficient for the planet. I also think transportation and just having people aware of transportation. Certainly the car you drive is something I usually, when I'm not driving 6 hours a day because of PCH being closed, I usually bike a lot of the way into work, and how much is that doing with my car being not terribly polluting? Not that much, but I enjoy being on the bike more than in the car is one reason. And part of that is just getting back to that reminder of myself, and then other people ask me, why are you doing that? You get sweaty, you have to bring an extra pair of clothes with you. Why? On a day-to-day basis, does that matter that much? But if we're thinking much more in terms of air travel and other things, certainly these things add up. And if it becomes kind of cool to think about how can we be a little careful and how can we be efficient in how we plan our days and how we get from point A to point B, I think that is something that is important, both from a standpoint of how it adds up, but also from a standpoint in getting people's attention, because, our carpooling versus individual and, various things, these things are very visible and are those strategy points for starting conversations.
Just to jump back onto CABs for a second, because I'm kind of a nerd and I like to put the numbers to it. I'm gonna wear my ecologist hat for a second and say, generally speaking, when you move from one trophic level, so if you move from plants to animals or from animals to the animals that consume those animals, there's about a 90% energy loss. So of all the energy that's converted into plant matter that's then consumed, it's about 10%. So if you're eating a plant, you're consuming, or rather, if you're eating 1 calorie of animal, that is actually equivalent to 10 calories worth of plants that are being wasted. So it's far more efficient to eat down those trophic levels. And I always thought that was a really interesting way to think about what we're eating. And then within those trophic levels, and to come back specifically to cows, a number that always has stuck in my head is what we're eating can make a huge difference even within being a meat eater versus a non-meat eater. And you can make a huge difference without going full vegan or full vegetarian by reducing what you eat or changing what you're eating. So in terms of equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, eating 1 calorie of cow is about 10 times less efficient than eating 1 calorie of chicken, and about 3.5 times less efficient than eating 1 calorie of pork. So even within eating meat, what you're eating makes a massive difference on the impacts that it has. So that's my nerdy spin off there. And then to go back to the single-use thing, and I might be stealing Trevor's thunder a little bit here, but I think about the reduce, reuse, recycle thing as really reduce, reuse, long ellipsis, very small print, recycle with a question mark. It's the reduce and reuse that really makes the difference. Recycling is questionable at best. So, and a lot of the recycling campaigns have been started by companies that have incentives to disincentivize you from taking action against their primary production in the first place. So they're the producers who are making it in the first place are the ones saying you should take individual action and recycle, and it's your responsibility to clean up our mess.
Yeah, all the great points were made. But what I could say is you could just like buy unnecessary things. You could avoid buying unnecessary things. That's something that you can easily do. And personally, I'm also like a minimalist, and sometimes I'm thinking about what if I didn't buy this like a couch? And sometimes I'm tempted to decorate my place in a nicer way, but I don't have my couch. I just have like one sort of table slash like a desk, and then one small like a furniture, and then batteries, and that's pretty much what I have. And everything else was already equipped by the landlord. So if you didn't, if you avoid like purchasing things or ordering stuff from Amazon, for instance, you could avoid like, emitting like greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the truck that really use the transportation of the products that you order through Amazon, for instance. So I think like just avoiding like purchasing unnecessary things, I think that's something that we could do as a consumer.
Thank you. And in hearing about all these different things that you would suggest, when natural disasters happen like the LA fires, do you think it encourages people like as a wake-up call to start looking into these solutions, or do you think it tends to scare people away from talking about this and why?
Say something while there's collective thoughts here. One thing that, hit home to me when these are happening is just, it's really discouraging, right? If you're thinking like the little bits of CO2 emissions that you've been kind of incrementally inching away at with, what electric car or, efficient gas vehicle you use and what, if you choose Amazon Prime Day or, various things, and then to just have this all go up in smoke literally, and just all of that that's there, and the scale of what's taking place is a little bit hard to just kind of not just feel so demotivated, like what was it all for, when, but we can't be fatalistic like that, right? We have to keep going, and yes, unfortunately, there are gonna be these setbacks, but the arc of history is long, and where we are in politics right now is, is it a particular place, but you all are young, many of you are young, much younger than me, and, and going to see a lot of evolving thoughts, a lot of evolving action, a lot of evolving change over, your next 10 years, even, and in that sense, it's a value. And can I just say for the recycling, I'll leave, that's all fine, except please recycle aluminum.
I think I'm still collecting my thoughts on this one, but, no, I'm still collecting my thoughts, because now I've forgotten the question. Can you ask me a question? This is the danger of being up here.
So I was asking, in lieu of natural disasters like the fire, do you think that it's a wake-up call to people to look into like some of the solutions that you all have suggested, or do you think it scares people away from the conversation even more?
I mean, it's such a huge question, and I guess I don't have is it one or is it the other? I think what I am learning, what I've been thinking about a lot in the last 2 weeks as the crisis came to my city, and how many crises have appeared on the front page of the newspaper in the last 12 months. And when they're not in any geography you've ever been to or care about, it's a really easy news story to dismiss and go on to the next one. So I've been sitting with what it means that this happened to the place that I love, and a place that I'm invested in, and a place where I want to grow my life, and where I have a lot of people that I love who have been, who've lost everything, right? And one of the hot takes that emerges in this kind of discourse is nobody should be living in these geographies. It's the political leaders' fault for developing, for zoning, paving the way for developers to be building in the wildland urban interface, blah, blah, blah. And I get that on an intellectual level, and it's a very radical argument. A lot of radical people love to say, this is just about, we need to sort of demarcate no-go zones on the earth, and humans need to go live somewhere else. Where I'm at on that issue is, that's all well and good until it starts happening to where you've built your life. And we are going to, the list of places that have been decimated by global change processes is going to become ever longer, and it's going to enroll more and more of us as its victims. Climate refugeeism used to be sort of like, the radical, the problem coming in the next century. And now we actually know there are tens of thousands of climate refugees in this city tonight. So as the problem comes closer and closer, and this is something that Dane was talking about, the temporality, the scalarity of climate change is really something that the human brain struggles to compute. It exceeds our understanding of the social, or like, the timescales at which it plays out at exceed the timescale of human life, blah, blah, blah. But as these things become more computable to us because they hit us in our neighborhoods, or they hit the neighborhoods of somebody that we love, people that we love, we can't do anything but start to care, and then start to change the nature of the conversation, that the solution can't be, sort of demarcating a bunch of spaces where we have to evacuate and then cram into other spaces, right? Not least because Americans hate density. That's sort of a different issue. But So at the extent that I don't really want to say, will this disaster make more of us care about climate change? I don't really know how to answer that question, but it seems to me that these last few years, I would hope are changing the collective conversation, the tractability, right? I think a lot about the environmentalism of political will. Political will is the thing that everyone comes back to for, we don't have a national climate change law, we don't have serious policy translating the very serious science that we've already done really well because of political will. Political will is like this nut that none of us can crack because it has to do with what Emily is talking about, the articulation in any given historical conjuncture between policy and politics. How do those things align? Mostly they're misaligned. Who has the collective social power to get them more aligned? So this stuff is really complicated, but it's to a point that was said earlier, the only solution is that we put our heads together and start working together on it and demanding that the people that hold more political power than us as everyday voters do something about it. We've just entered a new presidential administration that has made no bones about wanting to do absolutely nothing about it. But we're in a different position than we were in 2016 and in a different position than we were in 1997 when we refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol. There's so much going on at many different scales. The Inflation Reduction Act has supercharged renewable energy markets in a way that make the US delegation show up at the COP meeting in November in Azerbaijan and say, listen, we're probably going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords in a couple of months' time. And the global community looks at them and says, yes, we don't care because renewable energy markets are now viable. We can go ahead and do a lot of stuff, even with the US on paper out of this agreement. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it is slightly hopeful. We're in a different position. There's a lot of players in the space. The players that hold the most political power still refuse to make the most change because the oil industry is actively colluding with it, but it is up to us to band together and make a lot of noise because that's always how change works in democracies.
These are all awesome points. I think one thing that stuck out to me with this most recent disaster with the fires here, more so than in other disasters that I've followed, and I don't know if that's my perception being much closer to this one, or if this is something that is really changing, but the speed and amount of misinformation that came out and was spread, I found really astonishing. And I think that's something behind all of these points that people are making, is misinformation undercuts all of that. And so fighting that spread in your own knowledge and in the conversations you have with other people and in any space that you are able to do so is absolutely vital. Because if we can't agree on a single truth, there's no way we can possibly take any action. And unfortunately, studies show that misinformation is generally more effective than good information, partly because right now it's better funded in a lot of ways. And also it just doesn't have any burden of truth. So they can say anything. Doesn't have to be true because it's not in the first place. So I think fighting misinformation is an underpinning current to any climate action that needs to take place. And I don't have a solution for that. I think it's going to be a huge challenge in our near future. And as the media landscape develops over your lives, we'll see how that all plays out. It'll be really interesting. The other point I wanted to make is with climate migration, and in my work with sea level rise, climate migration is a big talking point, less so in California. Generally speaking, we have fairly vertical cliff faces on a lot of our beaches, so there's probably less people who are going to be displaced. But in the conversation generally, a lot of communities are facing complete annihilation by sea level rise because there is no amount of money that can save a barrier island that's going to be washed away when seas rise as little as 1 foot and a big storm comes in. So these communities are going to lose their space and they are going to be forced to move. So migration is happening right now and it's going to be happening a lot more in the future. And with those conversations, one of the solutions or options is called managed retreat, which is extremely unpopular you say that anywhere around coastal policy people, they're like, oh God, don't say that word. Managed retreat being planning to move out of that space ahead of time so that it can naturally erode, it can naturally change, it can naturally follow the processes that would otherwise. But over a long enough time scale, there's really two solutions. It's either managed retreat or unmanaged retreat. And so if you don't manage it, eventually the sea level rise is still going to happen. The big storm is still going to happen. And eventually those people are going to be displaced. So it's your choice which route you want to take. And one of those options is generally a lot less painful than the other, although maybe more painful sooner than might happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's the thing that worries me about the dialogue happening around the fires. And you know, I have the privilege of being able to have this conversation as an academic one, as someone who was affected by the fires, and I recognize the privilege inherent in that. But like one of the things I've seen is that when the connection between the fires and climate change is brought up, one of the reactions can be, don't talk to me about climate change right now, that my house burning, right? And that's like very real, right? Like I don't care about this big thing that's far away and distant. Like I just lost my house. I just lost everything. And or on the policy level, don't talk to me about climate change right now. These people we need to focus on the people who lost their house. And I'm like, yeah, we do. But like they're also connected. So I think my take is a little less optimistic. I think when these disasters happen, it is very politically expedient to not focus on the on the sprinkles on the cake, right? It's easier to focus on the cake than the sprinkles, but the sprinkles matter.
Yeah. I concur with a lot of points already made, and then especially I'm pretty kind of on the same page with what Trevor just said. If I really need to choose 1 or 0 to this particular question, my answer would be no. It would not serve as a wake-up call, ultimately. I mean, you could think about it, and some news articles already have pointed out that climate change sort of has facilitated the fires, you know, across Los Angeles, because basically like it has shaped the favorable conditions for dry weather and everything, and then like for these fires. In my case, like a few years ago, when I actually received a job offer, gladly a job offer from LMU, I really liked my job talk and everything, interaction with like, you know, LMU colleagues, my future colleagues. But one thing that actually made me slightly little hesitant to accept the job offer was the natural disasters, believe it or not. Seriously, I mean, earthquakes have nothing to do with climate change. I mean, you could make some like indirect connection, but that's sort of like, you know, out of touch. But dry weather, like a water shortage, like the fires. I mean, I had seen those news articles, like even when I was in New York City, where I was pursuing my PhD degree. So I was seriously like, became a hesitant. Like, should I accept this job offer? Is the living condition sort of good enough? Is it hospitable or not? Will it become like inhospitable? Because you cannot just focus on the current status. You also need to somewhat individually forecast your sort of future living conditions. So as Trevor pointed out, once there's a natural disaster, yeah, now I'm suffering. So who cares about climate change or global warming? You could connect the dots, but that's a bit far distant, sort of like, you know, things that you actually cannot easily see. So my answer would be no. It would not serve as a big wake-up call, although maybe some people might be more interested in it.
Today, microphone, please. So amazing answers. Thank you so much for talking about this. But kind of connecting the last two questions, right? Let's say, you know, we can snap our fingers and all the cows disappear, even though that might not be the best option. Or, you know, we stop single-use products. Climate change isn't, and the effects aren't just going to disappear overnight. That's even if we get to all of these goals and all these brain just ended, all these policies and all these, if we get to these standards, it's not just gonna disappear. So how would you recommend students or anyone to kind of keep motivated to keep on going on? Because like the fires aren't gonna disappear. It's gonna take a while. So how would you recommend motivation and long-term plans?
So I heard a quote and I've never been able to attribute it, but it stuck with me. And in about, I see some of my students in the room, in about 13 weeks' time, after I've led you into the depths of depression about all of this. And then I'll have a slide that has nothing on it but the words, "It's far too late and things are far too desperate for pessimism." It's far too late and things are far too desperate for pessimism. Pessimism is an utterly demotivating, paralyzing emotion, right? You have to have some hope that things will get better if you're going to make any progress towards it. And you'll see me, students, in 13 weeks muster my best optimism. And there is some. I think there is some. But I think you have to again recognize that, like, look, I mean, also on one hand, like, what else can you do? Right? What else are you going to do? What's the alternative? Right? Besides recognizing that, hey, look, I wake up every day and I think part of the nihilism is like, oh, I hope I make it. Maybe I can make a difference in the world. Maybe I will change things. You know, no. Every day you wake up and you make decisions that do impact the world. That is unavoidable. Over the course of your life, you will impact the world. And it's a good website called 80,000hours.org. You should check it out. It basically makes the argument that you're going to spend, after you leave this place, the next 40 years working 2,000 hours a year. So you're going to spend 80,000 hours working. How will you spend those hours? What impact will you have in your working life? You should think about that as you're choosing a career. What kind of impact do I want to curate over the course of my life? Because you will have an impact, that's unavoidable. Again, what else can you do? Right? You're going to go on living, you're going to have an impact. You just have to be thoughtful and intentional about crafting what that impact is.
So one thing I'd like to say, that it sounds silly, but I'm gonna say why I'm saying it. You know, Mars sucks. Okay.
Mars is not the answer.
We don't have an out here. We don't have a good backup option. And, you know, the positive way of looking at that is, on Earth, we're so much far ahead of where we would be trying to kind of repopulate a planet, or, you know, like trying to deal with how do we get oxygen and then, you know, like where there's big issues, but the world is a beautiful place and nature is very resilient in many ways. And, you know, we've got a lot of good too. And I think that's, you know, something in terms of kind of thinking optimistically, there is that. In terms of something I'd like people to think about, in terms of something that you maybe haven't done and haven't been in the aspect of doing, we've talked a lot about politics, policy. And one thing that was very interesting to me when I was working in science policy in the Senate is I kept getting in trouble with, you know, we'd have to kind of have any legislation we were ready to go through the Congressional Budget Office and the Library of Congress kind of reviewing, and they kept sending back notes to me saying, we don't build legislation off of the precautionary principle. And I was kind of like, well, why not, you know? But it was kind of like, you know, that's not, you know, we just go off what's kind of, so one of our challenges in government is kind of the retrospective, that we're always kind of like responding to problems rather than getting out ahead of things at the time. But something that I think individuals can do, that I was shocked at the level of intentionality that people addressed it with, was writing individual constituent mail. Like this, I don't think I didn't get nearly the same impact or interest if it was just signing on to something that was, already written by a nonprofit and that had 10,000 signatures, yeah, that takes some effort. But individuals that were writing heartfelt letters about an issue that was maybe even fairly obscure, the level of scrutiny and of kind of where does this align with kind of what I have out there, that the individual senators would say, what do I have out there in terms of where have I already made a statement or made a policy? Does this fit in with that? Is it against it? The level of effort that went into that was incredible, actually. And I do think that that's an area, you can vote, but I think getting your voice heard, and if there's an area that's a particular near and dear to your heart, take the time to send those, both your individual representatives, but also people that are on the committees where they're making that decision, these sorts of things. I think that is an area where you can have an outsized effort. And, sometimes people are very concerned about, oh, lobbyists are able to kind of get in there and do this stuff. Yeah, there is some of that, but part of that is the time and just getting that, the time to say, I care about this issue, and we can all do that. And I think that's more powerful than you might expect.
I love that. Democracy is a practice and hope is a practice too. And I love that idea of doing something so that, the lack of doing nothing, that's where the inaction, I think, is where a lot of the anxiety comes from. If we can choose something to commit to and show up to it regularly through the good times and the bad times, that is something that's within all of our control as individuals. And then, of course, riffing off my individual versus collective framework, because I think it's just so critical in this issue that we recognize what is within our individual control, our own consumptive behaviors, our own choices, how we cultivate our virtues and our values, moving through the world, spending our money, but also recognizing that we will not solve climate change alone. We will not survive natural disasters alone. We will not start the revolution alone. We will not live good lives alone. Find your community, cultivate your community, practice in that community, commit to something, and root down.
So I guess at this point, I'll share a little bit of my own personal philosophy, which would be somewhere along the lines of optimistic nihilism, particularly around this issue, that regardless of the outcome, for me personally, I would rather be on the side of going down with a good fight than not trying at all. And that has motivated my career choices largely, and I'm pretty happy with them. And I'm not particularly optimistic about the long-term outcomes of this issue, but I don't think that has any bearing on how much I care about it or how much I'm going to try to work on it, because I can only be pleasantly surprised by successes that we do have. The other thing I'll repeat that I think I said before is to think big and act small. So thinking about the huge issue of climate change can be overwhelming. Thinking about these problems, like we need to take them into consideration and contextualize our actions in that space, but our individual actions are going to be on a much smaller scale. And so taking pleasure in the local impacts in your community or in your municipality or whatever it is, even just among your friend group, that you had a good conversation about a topic that you cared about, or that you made somebody's day a little bit better, or you taught somebody something new about science or about climate change or whatever it is, those small wins, they matter. And thinking about those small scale impacts in the context of a larger problem is really important.
I think one of the great points that has been made is that being optimistic and then trying, not to be pessimistic. And think about climate change in a way that we are dealing with the grand sort of challenge, like issue that has been passed on to us, like through multiple generations. So it's not just the issue that we just created overnight. So we should not actually feel really pessimistic about it or too depressed about it. Basically, we are dealing with all the stuff done by the former generation, like our ancestors. So meaning that it's such a hard challenge to overcome, to address. So just don't be too pessimistic about it, and it's just okay. I mean, it's such a grand challenge. So I think having that kind of mindset might be a bit helpful. And then maybe, as daily basis, maybe, going back to my like a finders situation back in Korea. Sometimes me thinking of the place that I love, or like a place where my like people who I love, I think that is helpful when you sort of make connections between like climate change or other sustainability issues and the place you love. Like one of my sort of like, saying hello sort of like statements when I have a conversation with my parents, like through a video chat, sometimes I just ask them, how's the finder situation going? I know around this season of the year, we tend to get that kind of finders like even getting more serious. So because I care about them and I'm concerned about the public health issues that they might face with. And when they get older, who knows? Like how does that finder sort of play a role in some of their health related issues? You never know. So sometimes whenever I sort of think about the place that I love and then making it sort of like connected to some of these sustainability issues, it sort of keeps getting motivated to think about this issue and then to find some sort of like even like small solution through my academic research, but how can I sort of help contribute to tackling these issues?
Thank you all for your responses today. We would like to take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have something to ask our panel? Yes.
Do you understand? Oh, sure. I wasn't sure. So I just had a question, and this might be a little layered, but thinking about, and I'm sorry to bring it up, but like thinking about AI and thinking about on a few different levels. I think first of all, there is the misinformation conversation that I think can be amplified by AI. I think there's also a massive energy consumption question because of AI, because of the scales of energy that it's demanding. And then I think there is also the question about, given the computing power of AI, what are possible positive applications? So that might be a bit of a layered question, but what would be your thoughts in considering all of these factors about AI in relations to the problems and solutions with climate change?
I'll say from the Sea Grant like oceanography perspective, the ability to have larger, more detailed downscale modeling is absolutely vital to making accurate predictions, and accurate predictions allow for better action and better planning long term. So I think that's a huge area of opportunity. Also, AI and a lot of the other technological advancements that are happening right now in automation and autonomous drones and things like that, the ability to multiply our ability to collect data and to monitor various environmental systems to understand them better is accelerating dramatically, and that's really, really exciting. So I guess I'll take the positive spin on this, that there's a lot of really, really cool science that is happening and will be happening in the near future because of those advancements in the oceanography space. And the oceans are such a massive driver of climate change that understanding how those systems are operating currently will let us better predict how they will operate in the future.
On the energy piece, this is the same argument that gets levied against electric cars, and they're like, well, but now electric cars are just coal-powered cars. That's not a problem with the car, that's a problem with the energy grid, right? So the fact that you need massive amounts of energy to run AI, the large language models, that's not a problem with the AI, that's a problem with the energy grid, right? And that's a very easily solvable problem. That's a problem that we have technical solutions for. We just need the political will to implement them. And as you're saying, now increasingly the economics line up, which is nice.
My area of research is computational, and I actually do so most of what I do in terms of research for energy, it isn't in the lab at all. It's all just large computational models. And as a result, I'm probably a little bit biased, but it's also the case that a lot of times, even though there is a lot of energy use in that way, in terms of getting to those answers, they're more fundamental than some of the things you could do in the lab, and they're replacing some things you could do in the lab at times that's actually saving more. In terms of very large scale, I've worked, over the years with very large scale supercomputing centers and these sorts of areas. One possibility is that as those are centralized, they can also be put in places where they're more efficient and various things. That's not exactly happening when it's commercialized at the moment. And part of that is, getting back to some of the topics here, the economics of it. Certain energy is too cheap right now in terms of what it's actually costing us. And that's part of how this is all happening. If we were to get back to this idea of the life cycle assessment of what does it really cost to make energy in various places, it would naturally force aluminum to be produced in Iceland and, various places. There would be a lot of things that would be structured differently, and different governments are incentivizing in ways that are retrospective, that are kind of looking back on what has been a lot of times rather than looking forward. So there's issues with that, but I am optimistic going forward that will improve, that will be able to address and streamline a lot of experimental work that would have also been very costly and potentially polluting. And that as we go into alternative methods of computing with quantum computing, I think that we also have a lot of opportunity there to streamline.
Really quick, because I'm sure there's other questions, but I'm really glad you asked this question, because AI is going to be such a huge force moving forward, and it has huge energy implications. I am not somebody who large scale computes. I don't work with AI. So to the extent that I can say something here that's valuable, it would be, I think it's useful to think about AI as a resource scramble, the way that we have had resource scrambles in the past. And if we throw this new resource regime to things that we could have done better in the past, or things that we can do differently in the future, if we think about AI as a new suite of resources. In democratic contexts, the governance of resources is about how those resources are shared, who monopolizes the decision-making around those resources, how they're distributed, right? Those are things that should be on the table, so that, to Emily's point, the sort of AI for good, answering scientific questions, Dane's point too, getting more clear about the nature of problems and how to implement solutions, absolutely. There's an entire commercialization piece here that has totally different ends. And if we let them monopolize how AI and the resource scramble will flow out, it will look like the other extractive regimes that we as Homo sapiens have sort of used our time making this earth our home in predictable ways. It's the new administration just earmarked $1 billion to AI efforts yesterday. So again, like if we frame this about this is the new resource regime and the political power, how will it flow? Will it be a scramble model, or will it be a consultative, collective decision-making process?
You want to take your question up the front, right? Sure.
Sure. Hi. So I have a question about which do you guys think would have a quicker and more efficient rollout on like renewable energy, specifically solar and wind power, or nuclear reactors, specifically molten salt reactors, like liquid fluoride thorium reactors with a combination of fast breeder reactors? Does that have any opinions on that?
Having looked at like the various energy future, like there's lots of different models to say, okay, how can we meet energy demands in the future? I don't see a world in which we do this without nuclear, without sort of an aggressive and intentional rollout of nuclear, right? Like I'm a huge fan of wind wave solar, but it's just we need nuclear as well, and think environmentalists a lot of times love to shoot on goals, and I think this is one that we repeatedly shoot. So that's me on record as pro-nuclear.
How do you balance the priorities in your awareness and your action towards this compared to things that have direct consequences that happen like now? Like, I don't think I'm ignoring this because I don't think it's a problem and I don't think it's dire. I think I'm not giving it the attention it needs because still waking up tomorrow, still got rent to pay, still going to school, I still want a career, and like 1,000 other things that direct me at a higher impact and more immediate. So how do you recommend balancing that with all the things that matter?
That's a great question. Can I add on to my question? Based on what you were asking, how much does change in priorities do you think would make a difference if people change their priorities? So for example, instead of keeping up with fashion, maybe, I don't have to buy as much fashion because fashion wastes fashion is a resource suck, right? I'm not just talking physical resources, we're talking water, we're talking power, we're talking transportation. So if you were to, so what I'd like to ask you to speak to is, how do you choose to change your priorities? Right? I mean, I know I did mine. I chose to do it to live a very minimalist life, and my family thinks I'm crazy. But how do you go through that process? I mean, how would you advise people to go through that process to be like, what are my priorities, so that when I wake up in the morning, I can look myself in the mirror and feel good about myself, that I'm okay with where I am now, and then if I need to change it in 5 years, I can do that change. What kind of advice would you give to people for that?
I want to kind of address some thoughts on these, but also getting back to the nuclear power, that I think a lot of times there's kind of, which is better. And it's kind of like, it's not an either or, it's an and question, I think. And I think the same thing here, you have to figure out, okay, what class am I going to take? When am I going to get up? How am I going to get to, there's so many things, but I think that it's not an either or. Like, it's true that you can't put 100% focus and effort on everything. That's very impossible. But that's where I do think that it's so important to just, as you're able, shape the lens of how you view the world in this way. And then as you're making the decision, what job am I gonna get? It's gonna be influenced by that. And is this job consistent with my values of what I want to promote and what I want to do and what I want to be, seen as having invested in for the next 5 years, the next 10 years for my life, the arc of each of our influence. I think that's a way that they can go hand in hand, and that you could actually be making those day-to-day necessary decisions, but in a way that hopefully aligns long-term with your values and where you want to be seeing your impact. And I think, even getting back to being a minimalist, and, we all hear about influencers, and a lot of those are influencers on what can we buy more and more. But, I think so awesome if our influence could be, hey, I'm going to be more minimalist, and this is cool to be wearing these same jeans that are no longer in style, or, the more I'm not going to be the one to, to do that. But, if you all kind of, take up these sorts of things and kind of make the world you want to create one minor little decision at a time, I do think they're compatible, but I think it just requires having that awareness, and that's where having that awareness pervade every aspect of your life, I think has a lot of value.
I'll just say that I think many of you in this room are in a point in your life, you're in college, you're in your second decade of life. This is an extremely fertile time to be thinking about what you value and what kinds of powers you want to cultivate and live out for the rest of your life. And you happen to be in that journey of self-discovery and collective discovery together with the people that you choose to surround yourself with at an institution that tries very hard and puts in the big lights, that we want you to be using this time at a place like this to ask deeper questions about meaning and values and virtues, right? This is not simply a pass-through on the way to a high-paying job. So I hope that being in a Jesuit university, you have found yourselves served up these kinds of conversations, guided through the process to start thinking deeply about these things, which are the questions that will keep you warm for the rest of your life in a way that the endless treadmill of consumption will not keep you warm for the rest of your life. I hope that pay attention to that part of your journey here, because there's a lot that we can learn from the Jesuits, from various kinds of pedagogical models that your professors are bringing to you, to be thinking about the alignment of learning, action, and sort of the values stuff. So
Yeah, these are all great points, and this question hits home for me personally, as it's been a big part of my professional journey over the last 15 years or so. And I have personally taken different roles where I took more than a 50% pay cut several times now to change to a role because it was better aligned with where I ultimately wanted to end up. And financially that hurt a lot. Luckily, I'm very fortunate enough to have been in a situation where I could take that hit and live at least a somewhat comfortable life still. But going back to school, the costs associated with that, the time cost, changing career directions now 3 times. Ultimately, I'm very happy with the direction I'm going now, but for me, that was well worth it. But it's been a journey, an iterative journey. So while you're in a great place to be thinking about these questions now, this is also going to be a journey that you're going to be on for the rest of your lives. And it's never too late to change directions either. So I've done it a couple times. I'm only 32 right now. Some of my family members who were the most successful completely changed their career path in their mid-30s or even 40s, and it ended up extremely successful, and also a lot happier. And for myself, I was more than willing to trade the monetary gains for internal satisfaction and happiness ultimately. That was an easy trade for me.
So yeah, we have many questions. Let's go all the way in the back. I see you with the blue shirt, green insignia.
Given what's at stake, and also the warming we've already seen, as well as the warming that we're expected to see in the coming decades, do any of you think that the climate movement needs to drop its commitment to nonviolence, not towards people necessarily, but maybe towards infrastructure, thinking about fossil fuel infrastructure?
I love this question.
I love the question, Josh.
Let me speak. I'm in the middle of reading a book right now that I haven't finished. It's called like The Ministry for the Future.
Yes.
And I don't know how it ends. So don't, but yeah, it's definitely wrestling with that kind of, you know, the kind of greater moral questions of when is violence condoned in these kind of greater existential situations.
I'm not sure we have a commitment to nonviolence right now, actually. I mean, I think what's interesting that's going on is that there are different sectors doing different stuff. And I actually, when I was in grad school, I held the position that like Greenpeace was actually one of the more damaging environmental groups in the world because they made environmentalists seem crazy. And now I'm not so sure, because now I think there's increasingly like a space for like pushing the extreme pretty far out there, because then the rest of us actually look sane. Right? But yeah, I think the political answer to the question is, I think there's gonna, just like there's gonna be a menu of energy solutions that we're gonna need, I think there's also gonna be a menu of approaches that we need. And you should be a part of the ones that work and fit for you.
I assume you're referencing Malm's how to blow up a pipeline. So, I think it's I really love Trevor's point about, I'm not sure what we're living through and with right now is nonviolent. I think that's a supremely important observation. And it helps us get to this next point that, there are multiple forms of violence, one of which is structural violence, another of slow violence, right? There's a lot of violence being committed right now by the oil industry and other forms of extractive industry that is the status quo. And it raises a question for me about, is chaining oneself to a pipeline, is blowing up a pipeline, is sort of defacing physical fixed infrastructure, is that violence? Or is it vandalism? Under the penal code in this country, yes, you could be arrested and serve time. I don't mean to trivialize sort of what is violence mean, but there are limits. I talk about this a lot in my environmental justice class. The legal regime in this country, there are limits to what the US courts can render as justice, and there are also limits to what the courts can define as violence. There's a lot of everyday violence being committed that is not legible to the US legal system. And I think it's equally as, it's also possible to sort of turn that question around and say, would blowing up a pipeline be equal to the depravity that many people have lived on account of the oil extraction industry, bodies being hurt in the labor process, lung disease and other forms of sort of public health impacts of emissions, asthma rates in the Gulf Coast, in Cancer Alley, et cetera. So it's a question that's worth unpacking. I don't want to be on record as supporting violence, however.
Thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking question from you, Josh, and from the rest of the audience. Unfortunately for time, we do have to end here. Thank you all so much for coming in. Please, let's give a hand for our wonderful panelists tonight.